In the winter of 1908, a 2-year-old boy was ripped from his mother's arms in the middle of the night, placed inside a golden palanquin, and transported through the dark streets of Beijing to a palace so large it had its own weather. By morning, he was the ruler of 400 million people. He had no idea what was happening. He spent the entire ceremony screaming. His name was Puyi. And his life, from that first terrified morning on the dragon throne to his final years sweeping streets in the city where he once commanded armies, is one of the strangest stories the 20th century produced. A story about what happens when history decides to use a single human being as its crash test dummy. To understand Puyi, you have to understand what he was born into. The Qing dynasty had ruled China for over 250 years, since 1644. At its height, it commanded the largest economy on Earth, a civilization so ancient and so self-sufficient that when a British trade delegation arrived in 1793 and offered the emperor access to the entire catalog of Western technology, the emperor sent them home with a letter that essentially said, "We have everything we need, thank you for visiting." That confidence, once justified, had curdled into something dangerous by the time Puyi was born. China had lost 2 opium wars to the British. It had lost a war to Japan. Western powers had carved out enclaves in its major cities where Chinese law did not apply. The empire that had once looked at the rest of the world with polite indifference was now being eaten alive by it. Into this slow-motion collapse, on the 7th of February 1906, Puyi was born. His uncle was the emperor. His great-aunt was the Empress Dowager Cixi, the real power behind the throne, the woman who had spent decades manipulating emperors from behind a curtain and who was now dying. When the emperor died childless in November 1908, Cixi needed a successor she could control. She chose the toddler. She died the next day, which rather undermined her plan. So there he was, 2 years and 10 months old, Emperor of China, carried into the Forbidden City, 9,000 rooms, 1,000 years of imperial history, a city inside a city, and placed on a throne so enormous his feet didn't reach the edge of the seat. Court officials in elaborate robes knelt before him and pressed their foreheads to the floor. He burst into tears and told his father he wanted to go home. This was recorded in the official imperial documents as an expression of imperial wisdom. Growing up inside the Forbidden City was, and there is no other way to say this, completely insane. Puyi had hundreds of eunuchs whose entire purpose was to serve his every wish. No adult could discipline him. No adult could say no to him. He discovered early that he could have eunuchs beaten on a whim, and he did, regularly, because nobody stopped him. He shot his servants with an air rifle for entertainment. When he wanted something, it appeared. When he didn't want something, it vanished. Reality, as most people experience it, simply did not apply to Puyi. He was not a person. He was a living god. And living gods, it turns out, do not develop particularly well-adjusted personalities. Then, in 1911, the revolution came. An army garrison in Wuhan mutinied. The revolt spread with startling speed. Within months, the 2,000-year-old institution of Chinese imperial rule, which had outlasted the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, was gone. On the 12th of February 1912, 6-year-old Puyi abdicated. He was offered a choice: leave quietly and receive a generous annual allowance, or be beheaded when the rebels took Beijing. Everyone took the allowance. Puyi, who was 6, almost certainly had no idea any of this had happened. Here is where the story gets strange, because Puyi didn't leave. The new Republic of China, in one of history's more peculiar compromises, allowed the former emperor to remain in the Forbidden City, keep his title, keep his servants, keep his rituals, and continue to be addressed as emperor, by everyone inside the palace walls at least. Outside those walls, China had become a republic. Inside them, it was still 1890. Puyi spent the next 12 years in this bizarre suspended animation, the emperor of a palace that was no longer an empire, surrounded by thousands of people whose entire identity depended on pretending the last decade hadn't happened. He learned English from a Scottish tutor named Reginald Johnson, who gave him a bicycle, a telephone, and glasses, and who introduced him to the concept of a world beyond the Vermilion Walls. Puyi became obsessed with the idea of Oxford. He wanted to leave China entirely and become a student in England like a normal person. He actually tried to escape in 1922. The plan failed when his tutor refused to call him a taxi, and Puyi, Emperor of China, ruler of 400 million people, descendant of heaven, was too frightened to hail one himself. In 1924, a warlord named Feng Yushang seized Beijing and gave Puyi 3 hours to leave the Forbidden City. 3 hours. After 16 years of being treated as a living deity within those walls, Puyi walked out with a suitcase and nowhere to go. He was 18 years old. He had never paid for anything. He had never cooked a meal. He had never, as far as anyone could tell, experienced a single consequence for any action in his entire life. And now he was homeless in a city that no longer considered him anything at all. He fled to the Japanese concession in Tianjin, where he and his wife Wanrong lived among the cosmopolitan elite, spending money they didn't really have, surrounded by foreign powers who were very interested in him, not as a person, but as a symbol. Control over the last emperor of China meant control over the idea of imperial legitimacy, and the Japanese, who were in the process of building an empire of their own in northeast China, had a very specific use for that idea. In 1931, Japan invaded and occupied Manchuria. They needed a face for their new puppet state. They promised Puyi his throne back, a real throne, imperial power, the restoration of everything he had lost. They were lying. In 1932, Puyi was installed as the leader of Manchukuo, not as emperor, but as chief executive, a title with all the grandeur of a regional manager. 2 years later they upgraded him to emperor, but of a state that existed entirely to serve Japanese military ambitions, where his every decision required Japanese approval and his every public appearance was choreographed by Japanese handlers. He was an emperor again. He had less power than a city councilor. His wife Wanrong, isolated and ignored in the puppet palace, became addicted to opium. The Japanese occupation of Manchuria brought atrocities that Puyi later claimed he didn't know about, a claim that historians have greeted with considerable skepticism. When the Second World War ended in 1945 and Soviet troops swept into Manchuria, Puyi attempted to flee to Japan. He was captured at an airport, mid-escape, still wearing his imperial robes. The Soviets held him for 5 years. In 1950, they handed him to the newly victorious Chinese Communist Party, who tried him as a war criminal. He spent 9 years in a Chinese re-education facility. By every account, including his own, he emerged from it genuinely changed. Whether this was sincere transformation or the rational response of a man who understood that his survival depended on convincing his captors he had been transformed, is a question nobody can answer with certainty. He was pardoned in 1959 by Mao Zedong, who found it useful to present the last emperor of China as a model of successful communist rehabilitation. Puyi's first job after his release was as a gardener at the Beijing Botanical Gardens. The man who had once commanded the largest empire on earth pruned hedges for a living. He later became a researcher and editor. He married for the 5th time to a nurse named Li Shukshan who genuinely seemed to love him. In 1962, he visited the Forbidden City as a tourist, paid the entrance fee like everyone else, and spent the afternoon showing his wife where he used to play as a child. Other tourists didn't recognize him. He found this, by all accounts, somewhat liberating. He died on the 17th of October 1967 of kidney cancer during the Cultural Revolution, the same movement that was in the process of destroying everything Imperial China had ever built. His autobiography, written in the re-education facility and published under the title From Emperor to Citizen, remains one of the stranger memoirs in the history of literature. A man trying, with varying degrees of success, to explain how he went from being a living god to a gardener, and what exactly he learned in between.